Hi friends, I'm Dr. Oishika Chakrabarti, currently a senior resident in Obs and Gynae at AIIMS New Delhi, and I have done my MD in the same from PGI Chandigarh. As we all know, INICT is just breathing down on your necks. It's on the 5th of November. I have been through the same, and although the exams were different at that point, the fear and the anticipation is real. I really feel for you guys. So I thought, let me just make this journey a little bit easier for you, and let me know if this helps. Then maybe we can make a series on this. I'm trying to make a quick revision, like just flip through 1 or 2 pages kind of series for easy topics, because you already have a lot to remember, like 19 subjects. Even in Obs and Gynae, you'll have to remember quite a few things. So these are just important pointers, questions I'll be asked to you. So let's begin without further ado. So the topic for today, which is a must-know topic, very high-yield topic, is tubal ectopic pregnancy. And let's quickly, we'll do it under these subheadings, starting with what and where. So we all know what an ectopic pregnancy is. It is a pregnancy that is lying outside of the uterus. Coming to where, quickly look at this diagram. We know that the most common site is the tube, and within the tube, we know 80% of the pregnancies are in this region, that is the ampullary region, right? And this is also one of the wider regions, like after the fimbria, followed by the isthmus and the cornua. So there are obviously other sites of pregnancy also. Another question that is asked is, which is the least common site? So the least common is a cesarean scar ectopic pregnancy, and a little less common than, more common than that is cervical pregnancy, and then abdominal pregnancy, right? So coming back to this picture of the tube, so the ampullary region is the thickest, and the isthmic region is slightly thinner than that. So if there is a rupture, it is more likely to present earlier in an isthmic pregnancy rather than an ampullary pregnancy at 6 weeks and 8 weeks respectively. 6 weeks for isthmus, 8 weeks for ampulla. One might argue cornua is even smaller, even narrower. Then why is it at a later presentation, as you can see, at 12 weeks? This is because the muscle surrounds it, and it presents a little later because the tube takes time to stretch and rupture, right? And this is also the most dangerous because this will cause the maximum bleeding because it is at the angle of the uterus. The isthmic pregnancy, also the most common outcome will be rupture. Ampulla being slightly wider does not rupture that often. Before it can rupture, the most common outcome is a tubal abortion, right? So coming on to our next topic, which is again very important, which is risk factors. Another question that is asked to you is, what are the risk factors? So as a rule, anything that damages the tubes or the ciliary function of the tubes is a risk factor. Smoking, risk factor. Tubal surgery, risk factor. PID, risk factor. The most common among this is pelvic inflammatory disease. But if they ask you what is the biggest risk factor, the biggest risk factor is the history of a prior ectopic pregnancy. So friends, remember, if the patient who's coming to us has already a history of an ectopic pregnancy, then the risk of having an ectopic again is 15%. And if there is a history of 2 ectopic pregnancies, the risk doubles to almost 30%. Now coming to the presentation, typically this woman will be in the reproductive age group and will present with the classic triad of amenorrhea, the most common symptom, followed by abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding. The abdominal pain may be generalized or it may be localized, right? But when we come to examination, we'll find out a little bit more when we come to examination. Obviously, we'll start with the general physical examination. We'll look at the pulse, BP, and when you're looking at the pulse, BP, look at your question. There'll be certain buzzwords you will find, right? Like shock or hemodynamically unstable, tachycardia, hypotension. So look out for these words. You may or may not find them, but if you're finding them, be sure. And if it is an obs gynae question, somewhere have it at the back of your mind. This could be leading towards an ectopic pregnancy question, right? When we come to the per abdominal examination, we may find tenderness, right? Tenderness can be found even in an unruptured ectopic pregnancy. It is a common misconception. It is only found in ruptured ectopic. In ruptured ectopic, there will be a generalized tenderness because there is a hemoperitoneum. However, when the ectopic is growing, it will cause some tubal serosal stretching, and there may be localized tenderness over the area where the ectopic is growing. Another buzzword that you will find during this is that the patient will have something what we call the fornicial tenderness, right? So if there's a fornicial tenderness, always have your antenna up. This could be they could be talking about an ectopic pregnancy. Another thing similar to fornicial tenderness, when they are trying to do a TVS, in the same breath they'll say when you did the TVS to look for a diagnosis, the patient also had probe tenderness. So please be on a lookout for these words. Now coming very quickly to the diagnosis. So the best and easiest thing would be if on TVS we could find an adnexal mass with an empty uterus. So we will typically have an empty uterus with a thickened endometrial thickness, and we will have an an adnexal mass with significant peripheral vascularity, what we call the ring of fire sign, right? But this is unfortunately something that we don't find very often. We will usually find a patient who's come to us with UPT positive, and when we look at the scan, there is nothing in either the uterus or the adnexa, right? So what do we do in this case? We go for serial beta HCG monitoring. So what do we do in serial beta HCG monitoring? We will take beta HCG samples 48 hours apart. Right. So this is something I really want to stress on, because this is a place where things have really changed in the past few years. The guidelines have changed, and while looking at the previous year's questions, I found that some of the explanations are maybe still adhering to the older guidelines. So when we look at the two values of the beta HCG, we will look at the rise between the two values. So if the rise is more than 33%, then it is a reassuring sort of thing for us that this is most likely an intrauterine pregnancy, right? Conversely, if it is in the falling trend, then it is a failing pregnancy, whether intrauterine or extrauterine. If it is falling in a gray zone between these two, that there is a rise but it is less than 33% of the baseline, then it is pointing more towards an ectopic pregnancy. You cannot be sure, but this is pointing more towards an ectopic pregnancy, right? Another thing where the guidelines have changed, another point where the guidelines have changed. So the question is, till when do we continue this beta HCG monitoring? We continue this beta HCG monitoring till the time we see something on TVS. So do we keep repeating the TVS, and at what intervals? We don't need to do that. So there is a discriminatory value, a value of beta HCG at which if you do a TVS, you will definitely see a gestational sac, and that value is, the new value is 3510. In the older explanations, I am still seeing values of 1500 to 2000. Friends, this has changed. This is now 3510 according to the newer guidelines, to go for a more conservative approach so that we don't unnecessarily overtreat and damage intrauterine pregnancies that have not yet shown up on the scan, right? Now coming to the management. So management, it's very simple. If we just quickly divide it to ruptured versus unruptured ectopic. If it is a ruptured ectopic, friends, be very clear. It does not matter whether the patient is, whatever other scenario they are giving you. If it is a ruptured ectopic, if you have come to that diagnosis, the treatment is surgery. Okay, so the treatment is surgery. Now, what kind of a surgery should you go for? Should you go for a laparoscopy or should you go for a laparotomy? Again, very simple. If the patient is hemodynamically unstable, they are giving you a clinical scenario in which they are saying patient is UPT positive, and she has come with an ectopic pregnancy and the pulse rate is 120, BP is say, 80/40. This patient is hemodynamically unstable. Always, always, always go for a laparotomy. There is no question of going for a laparoscopy in a hemodynamically unstable patient. You will be further decreasing the venous return and compromising this patient further, right? However, if the patient is hemodynamically stable, then we can very well go for a laparoscopic salpingectomy. Again, one question that is asked is whether we should go for a salpingectomy versus a salpingostomy. So earlier people used to go for a salpingostomy, but right now, friends, there are very limited indications for going for a salpingostomy. Always go for a salpingectomy. Salpingostomy will only be done in a case where the contralateral tube of the patient is already damaged and this patient is desirous of fertility and does not want to let go of this tube, right? Now coming to the next, we have already dealt with ruptured ectopic. Coming to the next, which could, is a subset of questions where they really try to trick you and confuse you by giving you different case scenarios. Coming to an unruptured ectopic. So unruptured ectopic means you can go for either medical or surgical treatment, right? So just to make it easier, medical treatment you will go for in cases where, and within inverted commas I have written small ectopic. By small ectopic, I mean it looks kind of benign compared to the ones which need surgical treatment. So beta HCG will be lower, FCA will preferably be absent, the sac will be smaller, it will be unruptured and hemodynamically stable, right? So the cutoffs are 5000 for beta HCG, and if your fetal cardiac activity is absent, then we can allow the sac to grow a little bit bigger to 4 centimeters. But if we have a fetal cardiac activity, then a cutoff of 3.5 centimeter is taken. So friends, only if it is less than 3.5 centimeter with a present cardiac activity should we go for medical management with methotrexate, right? And the other indications for going for medical management is you have all this, plus there is no contraindication to the usage of methotrexate. Now we know methotrexate is a folate antagonist, so there are people who have immunosuppression, so we cannot give methotrexate to these people, right? Or who have severe, moderate to severe anemia, thrombocytopenia, leukopenia, right? Who have sensitivity to this particular drug, and who have active liver and lung disease or significant renal disease or peptic ulcer disease. And of course, a very, very important thing that people often forget, that this patient is not able to follow up, because once you give methotrexate, you will have to follow up with serial beta HCG, right? So coming to surgical, now this makes this very easy. We give surgical treatment in a case of unruptured ectopic when the scenario is exactly the opposite of this, which means your beta HCG is high, it's more than 5000, cardiac activity is present, the gestational sac is very big, like more than 4 centimeters, it is ruptured, patient is hemodynamically stable, there is some unstable, there is a contraindication to methotrexate. In addition, there are certain additional points that I have written over here. One is that you have given, methotrexate to this patient, and she has gone into a failed medical management. That is, despite giving methotrexate, this patient has not responded and the ectopic is persisting. And the other thing is, this patient is already planned for a tubal surgery. For example, she already has to go for, maybe an IVF or tubal clipping, and she does not need her tubes anymore, because, leaving the tubes behind, even if you give medical management, increases the risk of recurrence, right? Now, coming to the medical management, surgical we have already discussed. So medical management, we have mainly 2 regimens. One is a single dose regimen, which is the most commonly followed, and the multi-dose regimen. Dose, you people must remember, this is 50 milligram per meter square. This is you calculate the body surface area of the patient, and 50 milligram per meter square is given, and that day is marked as day 1, right? And on day 4 and day 7, you will send 2 beta HCG values. There is no need to send a beta HCG value on day 1. Day 1 to day 4, we might expect a slight rise in beta HCG. This does not mean it is a failed medical management. We will look for a fall in the beta HCG between day 4 and day 7, right? So if the fall is more than 15%, this means our therapy is working. And after this, we will follow weekly till your beta HCG normalizes and the normal lab values, the cutoffs are less than 5 international units. However, if this fall is suboptimal, if it is less than 15%, then we will go for the second dose of methotrexate again after day 7 and follow further again on day 4 and day 7 as described earlier. The multi-dose regimen on day 1, 3, 5, 7, that is on alternate days, 1 milligram per kg of methotrexate we will give intramuscular. Methotrexate doses are intramuscular, I'm sorry I forgot to mention. And on alternate days, day 2, 4, 6, 8, we will give folinic acid. So friends, that's it for ectopic pregnancy, tubal ectopic pregnancy. Thank you.